what is the next step with the National History Day?
So the next step would be, so the local contest was in Vermont, and now the national contest usually would be in Maryland. Um, but due to the coronavirus, it's a virtual contest this year.
So actually, a website in this instance is a really good thing.
Yeah. So it's an easy media for them to also review the same way that I would.
Right.
So yeah.
And what grade are you in?
I'm in ninth grade.
Oh, great. So who is the advisor?
Uh it was my teacher, it's actually two people. My ninth grade teacher, Mr. Shepler, Greg Shepler.
Yes.
Yeah, and then my eighth grade teacher, Lori Morse. So
Oh, but she was retired now, or
yeah.
is she still involved with
Uh,
this?
so she's retired, but she's helped me a little bit with my project.
Well, those are both great advisors to have.
Yeah.
Good.
All
Well,
right.
tell me how I can help you.
Okay. So first, can you introduce yourself, what you've done, with South Africa reporting, accolades, stuff like that? Can you introduce
Sure.
yourself? Yeah.
Sure. I'm David Goodman. I'm a journalist, and I'm the author of a book about South Africa's transformation from apartheid. I was a reporter in South Africa in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, both during apartheid, then also covering the period of transformation. And I lived in South Africa for a year um, during Nelson Mandela while he was president and covered his presidency, but had a particular focus on covering the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Um, this was Mandela was president from 94 to 99, a 5-year term. And this was a historic period when they were very much dealing with um, how to reckon with their history of apartheid as they moved forward. So it was a
Yeah.
fascinating time to be there.
Yeah. Okay. So, my first question is, I'm gonna start with, why did Nelson Mandela choose the Truth and Reconciliation Committee to deal with the crimes of apartheid instead of going for a Nuremberg trials format where they tried and then hanged everyone who was involved with committing those crimes?
Yes, this was a very delicate part of the negotiation to hold democratic elections, what to do about apartheid crimes. So, the primary difference between South Africa and Nazi Germany is that World War II, this was a war where there was a military victor, and the victors imposed the terms of the peace. And in this case, it was war crimes trials. South Africa did not have a declared war. This was a negotiated peace. And so, what to do about apartheid criminals was a very delicate topic, and in fact, delayed to some degree the time during which. So Nelson Mandela was released from prison in February 1990, and elections were held in 1994. So there was a 4-year period of really the negotiations were concluded before that, but over a period of 3 to 4 years, there was very strenuous negotiations. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the solution that they came up with to deal with apartheid crimes. And in a sense, this was a solution that was designed to make everybody uncomfortable and unhappy. Certainly, victims of apartheid crimes were unhappy that, raised the question that how this is not justice. The perpetrators of apartheid crimes complained that they were simply following orders and they should not be held responsible for essentially what the generals and the presidents were ordering them to do. So this solution was novel. There had not been a truth commission in any country prior to this. The gold standard is, of course, justice. You commit a crime, you're held accountable, you serve a sentence, you go to jail or whatever the crime is. They also had some very sobering failures that had preceded the South African model. You had Rwanda, which had a genocide. You had Yugoslavia, which also was trying to hold, this was a war in the heart of Europe. They were trying to hold the leaders accountable, and they
Yeah.
could not get convictions. There was also very good reason to believe that it would be very difficult to convict the leaders of apartheid and send them to jail. South Africa's democratic judiciary system was very young,
Yeah.
very weak.
Mhm.
So the solution that they came up with is, if we can't get justice, can we at least get truth? Can truth be a way to save us from the cycles of violence that have gripped other countries, sort of post-authoritarian countries? Now, I was very skeptical of this when I arrived. Who wouldn't be? I mean, if you
Yeah.
come from the States, you're used to jury trials and convictions and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
as I went around with the Truth Commission, I saw something that I did not expect, and that was the power of this commission with Archbishop Tutu, a Nobel Peace Laureate, as its leader. He was truly, well, was and is kind of a moral icon of the country, coming to small towns and listening to ordinary people tell their stories. Now, these people would not have access to the courts. They would not be able to hire the kinds of lawyers to take on a police chief or an army official. But they got to tell their stories. Um, they got to have that be a part of the official history and official record of South Africa. And on the flip side, the perpetrators were offered a deal. If they told the truth, they would be immune from prosecution. So this was the carrot. The stick was that if they did not come forward and speak about what they did, they would be subject to prosecution. So in practice, this was an incredible thing to see go on. In virtually every town in South Africa, you had small town officials and police who had carried out atrocities. They were above the law for a generation or two. And now they were having to confront the families and talk about what they'd done. And I should say, this was not only limited to, police and officials. Within the liberation movements, like Nelson Mandela's party, the African National Congress, they had also their own informal justice system, where informants and such were tried, and justice was meted out. Sometimes people were killed. So those were also things that had to be spoken to. And there's one more thing that we
Yeah.
have to note. While this was going on, the top enforcers of apartheid, the general who headed the South African army, a guy named General Magnus Malan, refused to speak before the Truth Commission. He was prosecuted by the Mandela government, this new government. And here was the guy, right? This was a guy at the helm of the military organization that had killed countless innocent victims. General Malan went on trial, and the young South African government threw everything that it had at this prosecution, and it wasn't enough. General Malan was acquitted. And all the big fish, all the enforcers saw this and they said, they'll never get me. So this is the larger context of that moment in the mid 90s when I was there. So now what do you get? The generals and such realize they can get away with it. The ordinary people say, we can't move forward unless we acknowledge what has happened in our town, in our country. So that's where the Truth Commission comes in. They traded justice for truth. And in the end, I concluded from what I saw and experienced, they succeeded in something that had eluded many other countries, which was they got peace in their transition.
Yeah. So would you compare it to like the United States when we think about justice? We think of like a logical system where if you commit a crime, you're shown at a jury, and then they like weigh what you did with like two parties, and then they do like a final say, and like you either go to jail or you do like there's like various consequences for your actions. So, but in South Africa, instead, what they did is they just collected information and just wanted both parties to reconcile and come to a closure. What do you think there was? Do you feel that there was justice served for the South Africans who were affected by this, or was it more just a closure saying that there was atrocities committed by both parties and we're just coming to like put that chapter behind us?
So when I first went to South Africa at the height of apartheid in the mid 1980s, there was South Africa was two worlds, or you could say four worlds. Okay, South Africa was this crazy assortment of racial groups that was ordered. That's what apartheid was. Every town, every city had not one, not two, but four town councils or city councils: white, black, colored, that's mixed race, and Indian. Four groups. The country was completely unwieldy. This didn't work. Um, so you had here, and the history books, there were white history books and there were black history books, and there were perhaps things in between. There was
Yeah.
no consensus around what South Africa's story was. So this was an effort to have, for the first time, one history of one South Africa, one story. To the question that you ask about justice, this was a different kind of justice that the Truth Commission pursued. It was restorative justice. It was the belief that perpetrators and victims could achieve a kind of justice outside the traditional, what is called retributive justice channel, in which there is a penalty, there's a crime and a penalty, or a crime and a punishment. Now you have crime and you have an attempt at reconciliation, at restoring justice. So it's a different model. It was new. And I would have to say that when we look at South Africa now in 2020, so this is a quarter century on from
Yeah.
when Nelson Mandela became president, there has been no, turning on each other the way that other countries have had. They have kept the peace. Um, this is not a simple happy ending story. Uh, the black majority in South Africa is still very much disadvantaged by generations of discrimination, but you at least have kept it from breaking into open warfare that has consumed many countries in both Europe and Africa. So I would say a measure of restorative justice was achieved.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, did you report on or did you witness any pushback from like the white population of South Africa? Like any, like I would expect that they would, kind of like be mad or like because they had like the upper hand, like they were like the top class for like decades, and now there's equality. Like, was there any harsh feelings that were coming from the white minority population?
So there were harsh feelings on both sides because the black majority had lost everything. I went to a farming community, so I wrote a book about the transformation of from apartheid, and I told the story through the eyes of four people who were sort of opposites. One was a former government assassin, and the other was the guy he tried to kill. The other was another was a farming community, a black farming community that was successful. It was a self-sufficient community for well over a century. They were forcibly removed from their lands by nearby white farmers under apartheid and dumped in the desert in what were called the so-called homelands or Bantustans. And this community, now that apartheid had ended, had come back. And now they were doing business with those white farmers. And there was a very tense peace in the farm country of South Africa. Um, this was as I say, a self-sufficient black farming community that was now reduced to really abject poverty. I was standing in their community. It had been literally reduced to rubble. We were standing in the blocks of their homes that had been bulldozed. Um, but they had to find a way to work with the farmers who bulldozed their home and stole their livestock. Um, so when you ask, were there hard feelings? There were hard feelings aplenty to go around. Yes, many whites felt very aggrieved by having to give up their power and privilege. I would say that many of them in the post-apartheid world, one of the difficult things to see when I was reporting on it is that whites, by and large, still retained economic power. They didn't have political power anymore, but they still ran the businesses. They still had, decent middle class lives. So in the period that I was reporting on in the late 90s while Mandela was president, you had, and this is one of the people I wrote about, this captures the tension of that moment. A black woman who was a squatter, of which a lot of the big cities had squatter camps around them, people just building shacks to live in. Um, and she was a domestic worker. She was cleaning the homes in one of the wealthiest communities in South Africa. She was also on the town council of that community. So here was a woman who had political power. She was determining the rules for the people she worked for, but she had no economic power because she was still a squatter and a domestic worker. And that has not gone away. So sure, whites could perhaps complain that they didn't have the privilege they once had, but they still have a lot of privilege. They have a lot of economic power. So, but look, people who lose a struggle are going to complain. And people, even who win in this case, have reason to feel that it didn't go far enough or fast enough.
Yeah. Uh, uh, when you interviewed Nelson Mandela, what was your personal opinion on whether South Africa will fail and not be able to achieve peace, or succeed and come to where they are now back then in the 90s?
So you're saying what was my opinion at that moment when
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was meeting him? So I covered a lot of his activities, which was really a privilege. He was certainly, a hero of mine. I was also reporting on him.
yeah,
Um, Mandela was a transcendent figure and a transformative figure because in his own personal story, because of the personal suffering that he endured, 27 years in prison, and his decision to forgive his jailers, forgive the white minority for what had happened, few people could say they had suffered more than Nelson Mandela. So he became this moral icon. And if Mandela, after what he had endured, um, could forgive, could say to people, we cannot take up arms, we cannot take revenge on whites. If he said that, he was in a unique position to be sort of beyond reproach, beyond debate. So it was hugely important that he had the moral authority that he had. Not just any politician could have pulled that off. So as I traveled around and saw Mandela and what it was like when he would come into a community, um, he has a very different air than normal people. He has a very regal air. You know, he would come in, he stands very erect, he speaks with this cadence that people were very familiar with in South Africa. Um, it's very sort of professorial, like he's a professor teaching people, and he would often wave his finger like this to make his point. And he was teaching people. He was teaching people through his own model. How he was really modeling how the country had to be, both white and black, as they move forward. He was also an extremely shrewd political operator. There's a lot of warm and fuzzy images of him, which are accurate too. Um, he was a beloved leader, but he was a very calculating and very smart in how he wielded power. He went to the heart of the white minority and embraced many of their symbols. There was a movie made about one of them in which rugby is the much beloved national sports, most primarily of white people. And I will say that in my travels in the 1980s in apartheid South Africa, there were sanctions against South Africa.
Yes.
And the most painful, by far, to ordinary South Africa, the most painful sanction was the sporting boycott, which prevented their beloved national team, the Springboks, from competing against the top world powers in rugby. So rugby was sort of an apartheid symbol to a lot of Black South Africans. There were a couple of Black players on the team. That was almost, that was often held up as, they would say, see, we're not so racist. But of course, it was basically a white team and a white sport. So Mandela becomes president. As part of the settlement, and this was hugely meaningful to white South Africans, the World Cup of Rugby was held in South Africa I believe it was 1994, right as Mandela becomes president.
Yeah.
And Mandela walks onto the field wearing the jersey of the Springboks captain. And in one incredible stroke, he co-opts the symbol of white supremacy to become his symbol, to be a national symbol, not a racial symbol. He would do that again and again, every opportunity you have. He went to sit down for tea with Betsy Verwoerd. She was the wife of the former prime minister known as the architect of apartheid. She was revered by white South Africans. And he went to have tea with her. And just the images, and believe me, they got plenty of images. He wanted those images to go out. The image of these two dignified leaders having a cordial tea was extremely powerful. So he was a master of symbolism, and he was also a master at, navigating the minefield that is between war and peace.
Yeah. And final question. Were there any memorable words spoken to you by Nelson Mandela?
Well, I mean, your one-on-one time with Nelson Mandela is very limited.
Yeah, yeah.
I was a reporter covering him. I remember when I first met him, this was first met him one-on-one. it was when he went back to prison. And I got a call shortly after I'd arrived in South Africa, um, asking if I would like to go to jail with Nelson Mandela. So this was a pretty unusual question. I didn't know what this was about. And his press aide explained to me that he was making his first return trip to the last of 3 prisons that he was held in during his 27 years. And would I like to join him, be part of a small press pool, accompanied him. So this was a place where I again kind of saw what I think of as the political Aikido. Aikido is the martial art where you use the energy of your opponent against them. And he was a master of that, taking, white resentment and grievance and just transforming it into something else to help what he was trying to accomplish. So we went to this prison. It was very strange to drive into a jail with a banner over the entrance saying, "Welcome, welcome, President Mandela." This was their most famous prisoner. And to see the guards and the officials, acting as if, royalty had arrived in their midst. He was their prisoner.
Yeah.
Just a few years before, 5 years before, he was in jail with them. So at that moment, anyway, we there were things that he said, but I think the thing that I saw that was most so as he was walking away from a cottage where his prison was actually a pleasant little garden cottage. He had been in this prison for 2.5 years. He was, as they said, being prepared to be re-entered into society. So anyway, his press aide says, President Mandela, this is David Goodman. He is a reporter here from the States. He's new here. So there was only a handful of international journalists there.
Yeah.
And he did what he did to everyone who he greeted. He held my hand and we walked holding hands through the prison grounds for a short ways, where he chatted with me. What did I think of the country? What was, it was just sort of small talk.
Yeah.
But there was an intimacy always. When Vice President Al Gore came, I was there, and they walk out onto the steps of the presidential mansion. The first thing Mandela does is take Vice President Gore's hand, and they're standing there holding hands, these two, world leaders.
Yeah.
It's not an image that we're accustomed to seeing here. But it was how he did politics, which was first and foremost, it was personal. And he made a connection with you, not with the stories, not with the resentments and the prejudices that we all have, but he made a connection with you. And that's where the politics flowed from. So part of the secret of how he led this transformation of peace was that he essentially made peace with everyone who he encountered in a certain way. So that's a story that I remember.
Yeah. Alrighty. Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Thank you for your information. It's really helpful.
Thank
And,
you.
yeah.
Good luck with this, with the National History Day. It's an incredibly impressive website that you've made. I was really very impressed. So congratulations on that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Well,
All right.
let me know what happens in National History Day.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, good luck.
Okay. Thank you. Have a good day.
You
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.